Welcome to the One-Year Book of Mormon. A non-Mormon reads through the Book of Mormon. 1 Nephi, chapter 7. At the beginning of this chapter, Lehi sends his sons back to Jerusalem to get a man named Ishmael and his family. My sarcastic translation of the opening verses of this chapter is, "Oh crap, I forgot that Lehi's children are all men, and that won't work, so I'd better tell them to return to Jerusalem again to get some females, so as they can make some babies." Seriously? God sends Lehi out of Jerusalem, and they travel 3 days, but also 200 miles somehow, to the mouth of the Red Sea. Then Lehi turns around and sends his son back there, all 4 of his sons back there, to get the scriptures, because somehow the great prophet Lehi didn't have copies of them for himself, but the wicked Laban did. And then after the boys get safely back with the plates, even though it required Nephi murdering his uncle to get them, Lehi turns around again and sends his sons right back to Jerusalem, where one of them committed a murder. Makes perfect sense. In verse 2, we get an introduction to Ishmael, except we're not really told anything about him. We know he lives in Jerusalem, and that's it. Later on in verse 6, we find out that he has a wife, 2 sons, and their families, but we're not sure how many that is, and 5 daughters. We don't know anything about his lineage or whether he was wealthy or anything else. And then verse 5, we're told that God did soften the heart of Ishmael, so that he would join with Nephi and his brothers and go down to Lehi. And that makes me ask, what about free agency? Because Mormonism is very anti-Calvinistic and claims that God never forces or coerces men into doing things, but they have problems not just with the Bible, which they could claim is not correct, not translated correctly, but then also you've got the Book of Mormon, which they do think was translated correctly, and you still have things like this of God overriding man's free agency so as to soften men's hearts. In verse 6, we read that Nephi's brothers, Laman and Lemuel, plus Ishmael's sons and their families, and 2 of Ishmael's daughters, quote, did rebel against us, yea, against me, Nephi, and Sam and their father Ishmael, and his wife, and his 3 other daughters. And the rebellion was they wanted to go back to Jerusalem. This is before they even make it to the tents of Lehi, which is presumably only a 3 days walk from there. Although one could argue that they took longer. They went slower in this portion than they did when Lehi originally left Jerusalem. Verses 8 through 15 consist of Nephi chastising his brothers for wanting to return to Jerusalem after their father had prophesied that it would be destroyed, and for forgetting about the angel that had spoken to them just a few chapters ago when they beat Nephi and Sam after failing to get the plates from Laban. So, of course, older brothers do what older brothers do. In verse 16, they get mad at Nephi for telling them what to do. And then they tie him up and leave him to die. This sounds like Joseph Smith borrowed from the story in the Bible of Joseph and his brothers who hated him. But Nephi prays to God for deliverance and for, quote, strength that I may burst these bands with which I am bound. Remind anybody of maybe Samson? Like Joseph Smith was just taking bits and pieces from the Bible and cobbling them together to make a new story. And in verse 18, the bonds miraculously loosen and Nephi is freed. What are Ishmael, Mrs. Ishmael, the 3 good daughters, and Sam doing all this time? We aren't told. Why wasn't Ishmael insisting that his sons and Laman and Lemuel not take part in murder? No answer. Why didn't they otherwise prevent the 2 brothers from acting this way? Even if they hadn't, wouldn't they have stayed with Nephi and freed him? So that the rebellious party went back to Jerusalem, but they stayed with Nephi, so Nephi wasn't actually in danger of dying? Again, we have no answers, no reasoning to fill in these many plot holes. Of course, after the miraculous delivery, the brothers are still mad at Nephi, but this time One of Ishmael's daughters, we're not told whether it's one of the two good ones or the three good ones or the two bad ones, and one of Ishmael's sons and Ishmael's wife, not Ishmael himself, plead with the brothers to stop. So they not only stop, but eventually become sorrowful because of their wickedness, insomuch that they did bow down before me. Kind of like Joseph again, with his brothers bowing down. And they asked for forgiveness, and Nephi frankly forgave them, which sounds like Jesus' parable in Luke, and encouraged them to pray to God for forgiveness. And then they continued on their journey, came to their father, who again flouted the law of Moses and did offer sacrifices and burnt offerings, not at the temple and without a Levitical priest. And that's the end of the story in this chapter, but I want to go back and focus on one section because it's one of the rare timestamps in the Book of Mormon and actually makes a big problem for the Book of Mormon chronology, and particularly the LDS dates given in the non-canonical / non-scriptural dates in the chapter headings. Verse 13 is Nephi saying that at some future period the destruction of Jerusalem will happen, quote, "For all things which the Lord hath spoken concerning the destruction of Jerusalem must be fulfilled." So far, so good. Not a problem. But then in verse 14, Nephi says, "Jeremiah have they cast into prison." When could this have happened? In the book of Jeremiah, we read in chapter 32 and chapter 37 about Jeremiah being thrown into prison on two separate occasions, but they are in very close proximity to each other, within a year. The book of Jeremiah is not in chronological order, so 32 actually takes place after chapter 37. We know that because chapter 32 is said to be in the 10th year of the reign of Zedekiah, whereas chapter 37 takes place at the beginning of the siege, which Ezekiel tells us is in the 9th year of the reign of Zedekiah. So both imprisonments took place during the time of the besiegement of the city, which leaves no time for Nephi and his brothers to go back to Ishmael to get them out of Jerusalem. There is no mention in the Book of Mormon about any besiegement at all. Further, if it happened in the 9th or 10th year of Zedekiah, then that would mean that a full decade, or at least close to it, had passed between 1 Nephi chapter 1 and 1 Nephi chapter 7, which is possible. There's nothing in these chapters that says only a few days, weeks, or months had passed away, but the time given does not lend itself well to saying that it was a decade from the time Lehi and his family left Jerusalem until the time Nephi and his brothers come back with Ishmael and his family. Does cause problems with the chapter headings in the LDS version of the Book of Mormon because it gives as a general time frame for this section and most of 1 Nephi as being approximately 600 BC to 592 BC. And if this was 10 years after the reign of Zedekiah began, then it would have to be 2 years after that before they even get back to start the 8 years of the wilderness wandering. Non-LDS Mormons, of course, aren't compelled to believe in the dates that the LDS Church gives out. And even LDS Mormons may not necessarily accept them as accurate. They are allowed to have differences of opinion. However, the Book of Mormon in 2 Nephi records that 30 years passed between the time that Lehi left Jerusalem and the completion of the building of the temple in the Americas. So the more time that is spent in the old world, the less time there is in the new world. And since Nephi and his brothers didn't get married and start having children until they returned with Ishmael and his daughters, then that greatly reduces the population of the Book of Mormon people once they arrive in America. The earlier they get married, the more time they have for having children. They never say exactly how many children that they have during the wilderness wanderings of 8 years, or indeed while they're at Bountiful or on the ship, or once they get to the Americas. But it just mentions, just generally speaking, that their wives had children while they're in the wilderness. So to summarize, there simply isn't enough time. If Jeremiah was in prison at the time Nephi brought Ishmael out of Jerusalem, then Jerusalem would have been besieged at that time, and they couldn't have gotten in, much less out. And then that would also be 18 years before they even get to the Americas, leaving only 12 years to split apart from the Lamanites and to build the temple. That would also be 10 less years of having babies, which means that if this 10 years was before the 8 years, so it was 18 years between the time they left Jerusalem until they began their voyage to the Americas, then we only have 12 years in the Americas, and the oldest children would be most likely only teenagers or even younger. So you would have maybe a dozen men, or even half a dozen men, with the rest being teenagers or little kids, to build a temple. If you haven't read about the temple in the Book of Mormon, just note that Nephi records that they were able to build the temple, quote, after the manner of the temple of Solomon. In 1 Kings 5 and 6, we are told how Solomon built the temple. We are told in chapter 6 that it took 7 years to complete. And in chapter 5, we are told that there were 30,000 men from the nation of Israel that were sent to Lebanon, 10,000 a month by courses. A month they were in Lebanon and 2 months at home. Plus, there were 70,000 or 70,000 that bear burdens, and 80,000 or 80,000 hewers in the mountains. So 80,000 plus 70,000 plus 30,000 is 180,000 men over the course of 7 years. And the Nephites built a temple like Solomon's in, we're not told exactly how many years, and we don't know exactly how many people there were, but at the most it would have been just a few years and maybe a dozen or two men, and maybe another dozen or two teenage boys. I guess the women could have been involved too, but we're still almost certainly looking at less than 100 men, 100 people altogether. Just exactly how was it like the Temple of Solomon? It would be difficult enough to believe such a thing, even given the LDS chronology, which is the shortest possible time spent before Nephi and his brothers get married and have children. But if it's like the Book of Mormon sounds, that Jeremiah was in prison, which was 10 years later, then it becomes even more difficult to believe. In fact, it is most literally unbelievable.